We are in 1 Samuel 24 today. We'll make our way through 24 through 26, touching on some high points as we continue our series on the life and story of David. But it's not really the story of David, it's the story of God is writing a story through David that we get to participate in. So imagine this scenario that's been described. David has been locked in a chase for years. The pursuit of Saul against him. Some scholars believe 4 years, some believe all the way to potentially even 15 years that David is running for his life. So David is locked in this chase for years. He's running for your life. He's moving from location to location, always looking over his shoulder, always living in fear, never knowing if today is his last day, if the king is going to catch up to him, and kill him. Like, imagine living that way. Imagine the sense of uncertainty, the sense of dread, the sense of fear, the anxiety, the awareness that you have to have, the attentiveness to your surrounding conditions. Joshua talked a little bit about that last week as they lived life in Haiti, having to be constantly aware of what was going on around him all the time. And not only for your life, but for the lives of those that you love who have entrusted themselves to you. And now imagine your enemy has unknowingly and mistakenly walked right into your line of sight with no protection. You can take him out and have the justification, have the validation to do so. Well, this is the position that David finds himself in, not just once, but twice. David is on the run. He is a fugitive. Saul wants him dead. He has unleashed an army of trained assassins to hunt down David and kill him. And David runs. He and his hand of this kind of renegade misfits tribe that he has, they hide. They hide in random towns and cities and forests and deserts. They hide in caves. I mean, think about it. David has a family. David has people that he loves. He has a wife. He has children. He's tired. He's homeless. He's not getting much sleep. He is mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually spent. His men are exhausted and hungry. Like, we can't imagine life on the run like David is going through. And in this text, David and his men find themselves hiding in a cave in the wilderness in En-gedi, where unexpectedly Saul enters this very cave. The English translation says to relieve himself, and that's exactly what it means. Doesn't mean like he's going to take a nap. It means like nature calls. And Saul steps into the cave to literally relieve himself. And that's where we picked up in the text in 24, again, 1 through 3. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, "Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi." And Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the Wild Goats Rocks. I don't know what that is. I'm assuming it's named that because there was, wild goats there. But here they are in front of the Wild Goats Rocks, and he came to the sheepfolds by the way where there was a cave. And Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. Like, what an opportunity for David to end this whole ordeal. Saul is exposed and vulnerable, like literally, right? He's exposed and vulnerable. Perhaps there's no more of a vulnerable place to be than where Saul is, relieving himself in this cave. Like, think about it. One justified kill, and the hunt is over. It is over for both David and his loyal men, who, by the way, are equally as impacted as David in a lot of ways, aren't they? They too are away from family, friends, on the move, on the run. So naturally, his men encouraged David to take advantage of what appears to be a God-given opportunity. And again, we can kind of echo what they say. It seems like God has just provided this opportunity for David, this anointed king, to take out Saul once and for all, and the chase is over and David becomes king. Verse 4, the men of David said to him, "Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you." Like, David, God is in this. Like, why else would this happen? To Saul, to be in the very cave in which you are hiding, vulnerable, exposed. Like, this has to be a God thing. Now, we learn from this story we have to be very careful of how quickly we attribute things to God, right? Now, not everything that appears to be a God opportunity is a God opportunity, no matter if it appears that way or not. Well, let's be honest. Like, if I was David, I would probably have turned that cave into Saul's grave. You're probably with me. If I'm David in that moment, seems like an opportunity, it's justified, my life is on the line, I've spent years of time running from Saul, the most powerful person in the kingdom. Usually what Saul wants, he gets. If Saul wants David dead, that seems to be the end game for David. And in that moment, emotionally spent, exhausted, tired, hungry, tired of sleeping on rocks, living in caves, hiding in forests, never knowing who's going to betray you and when. There's other stories intertwined in this one we don't have time to dig into, where people are betraying David, they're turning their back, they're pointing fingers. Here's David to Saul. So in this moment, it makes sense for David to turn this cave into a grave. But David has a different perspective. Verse 5, afterwards, David rose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And afterwards, David's heart struck him because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing that he is the Lord's anointed." So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. David refuses to kill Saul. He simply cuts off the corner of his robe, and then his heart is smitten by just taking a corner of Saul's robe, when Saul's robe would have represented his royalty, his status. David says, like, who am I to even raise my hand against God's anointed? David refuses to kill Saul. Instead, important, he will trust God with the process. He will trust God with the process. Verse 8. Afterward, David also arose, went out of the cave. He called after Saul, "My lord the king." And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. And David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of men who say, 'Behold, David seeks your harm'? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand, for by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it." David refuses to kill Saul. He does not want to take the kingdom by force. David does not want to win the people by killing their king. David trusts that God is writing a bigger and better story. As soon as David notifies Saul of the mercy that he has shown him, Saul gives up his unjustified pursuit of David for a moment, temporarily. Look at verse 16 as the story continues. And as soon as David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. He said to David, "You are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. You have declared this day how you have dealt well with me, and that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. And now behold, I know that you shall surely be the king, that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house. David swore this to Saul. Then Saul went home, but David and his men went up the stronghold. And so David allows Saul to go free, and Saul gives up this pursuit of David for a moment. Saul even acknowledges in this text, like, I realize, like, you're going to be the king. Just promise me that you're not going to harm my family, my generations behind me. And David says, I'm not going to harm you. And so Saul gives it up. Now, if we fast forward in the story, Saul, again, he reneges on his promise, and he is back on David's trail. And this time, Saul receives a tip that David is in the wilderness of Ziph. So same scenario, different scene. David has a second opportunity to kill Saul. Saul has already broken his promise. He's pursuing David again. So David seems to have more reason, more justification to take out his enemy. But again, he turns it down. Chapter 26, verse 6. David said to Ahimelech the Hittite and to Joab's brother Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, will you go down with me into the camp to Saul? And Abishai said, I will go down with you. So just kind of the picture here, David's again hiding, and Saul and his men have camped in the valley that is below where David is hiding. And so as they're sleeping at night, David says, hey, we're going to go into the camp. So David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there lay Saul sleeping within the encampment with his spear struck in the ground at his head, and Abner and the army lay around him. Then Abishai said to David, God has given your enemy into your hand this day. Now please let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear. I will not even strike him twice. But David said to Abishai, do not destroy him. For who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? And David said, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed, but take now the spear that is at his head and the jug of water, and let's go. So David took the spear and the jug of water from Saul's head, and they went away. No man saw it or knew it, nor did any awake, for they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. So again, same situation, different scene. David again has the opportunity to take Saul with just even one of his men, with a single stroke of his spear, could eliminate Saul, who again for years has pursued David, who has tried to hunt David down, who wants to kill David. Seems like this is David's opportunity. And he pulls back. He allows God to work his process. David again reminds Saul, like, I have no ill intention towards you. Saul again is remorseful. He promises David, this time the pursuit is over. And this time it is. This will be the last time that Saul and David interact. Verse 21, Saul said, I have sinned. Return, my son David, for I will no more do you harm, because my life was precious in your eyes this day. Behold, I've acted foolishly. I've made a great mistake. And David answered, here's your spear, O king. Let one of the young men come over and take it. The Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness. For the Lord gave you into my hand today, and I would not put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. Behold, as your life was precious this day in my sight, so may my life be precious in the sight of the Lord, and may he deliver me out of all tribulation. Then Saul said to David, blessed be you, my son David, for you will do many things and will succeed in them. So David went his way, on the run again, by the way, and Saul returned to his place. Second time, David has the opportunity to take Saul. The text even indicates that God provided this opportunity. But again, David refuses to kill Saul. So let me give you just a few thoughts that I want to unpack in these chapters of the David story. A couple of things that we are reminded of. First, I would say we need to be reminded that God's timing is always best. God's timing is always best. And so we trust him. God's timing is always best. You see, when we face difficult circumstances, our tendency is to take matters into our own hands. I am way more like Saul in this story than I am David. I'm way more like Saul. I want to be in control. I want to work things out on my own. I want to make things happen. I want to speed up the process. I want to get there as quickly as possible. I am impatient. I tend to react to my fears and my insecurities and my circumstances and my uncertainties in life. I tend to react to those moments by worrying and by scrambling and by trying to make things happen. I tend to do that instead of trusting, resting in God, believing that His processes are always best. You see, this story reminds us that God is writing a bigger story and a better story. That God's story is bigger and better than my story. That God will settle accounts with Saul in His own time. And David is learning to trust God's timing. Now, it is a lesson that David often forgets. But God is doing His work in David to teach David to trust Him, even the most difficult of circumstances. And we need to be reminded on the regular to trust God's timing, to trust that He is sovereign and that He is good and that He is working all things for His glory and for our benefit. I don't know what it is in your life that you are seeking to control. I don't know what it is that you're seeking to take matters into your own hands. I don't know what it is that you're seeking to get out in front of it and you're seeking to take it over in your life. But what I want to encourage you to do this morning is to trust God's timing, to let Him do His work. Now, hear me. We talked about this in our forgiveness series. This encouragement is not to allow someone's sin or evil or abuse to run rampant in your life. Like you notice in the story, David is on the move, isn't he? He's going from place to place to place to place. He is doing what it takes to protect his life while he is learning to trust God in the process and allowing God to work in His own way and in His own time. It would have been very easy for David to say, this is my moment. This is my opportunity. God has laid it out before me. I kind of get it round one. I kind of get like Saul's relieving himself. David has this opportunity and he pulls back because Saul is God's anointed king. So he pulls back. I get it round one. Round two, it seems like David would have said, I missed it the first time, but God has given it to me again. I'm not going to miss this opportunity. That's how I would react. And yet David pulls back, trusting the process, trusting God's timing. Now, let me encourage you, City Church, there are times to run and move and be intentional, and there are times to wait and rest and be still. And it is by trusting and resting in who God is and what He is doing that we learn to navigate the difference. That God is writing a bigger story. That God is writing a better story. And I can trust Him. Which leads to another reminder from this text. And this is so important. God often does His deepest and I would say best work in the wilderness. God often does His deepest and best work in the wilderness. En-Gedi was an oasis in the vast desert of harsh badlands. David spent years in these wilderness environments. And it is in these seasons of David's life, in these wilderness seasons, these desert seasons, it is in these seasons that God often did His deepest work in David's soul. David did not start out in the desert, did he? He started out as a shepherd. He started out as a giant slayer. David's not going to end in the desert. He will end as the king of Israel, the greatest king of Israel. That would be the forerunner of Jesus himself. David did not start in the desert. He does not end up in the desert. But in his formative years, he spent significant time in the wilderness of life. By the way, just like almost everyone I know who pursues God deeply while living in the reality of a broken world. Like David, we don't choose the desert, do we? We are forced there. But it is in the desert where our soul is shaped, where we are forced to confront the reality of the broken world in which we live, and where we are forced to confront the struggles and the sins of our own soul and heart. Wilderness seasons, life in the desert comes unexpectedly. You've been there. You're living life just fine. You're working the job, taking care of the house, making the car payment, going to school, taking the kids to practice, spending time with the grandparents. And then suddenly, without warning, you find yourself in the wilderness, in the desert of life. This turmoil, this wilderness, this desert, it may happen inside of you. You ever been there? Heart matters. Soul matters. Doubt, fear, uncertainty, anxiety. Heart issues. Heart matters. Soul matters. The wilderness happens deep in the corners of our heart at times. I don't know if I believe anymore. I don't know what to do with this. I'm struggling with my faith. I don't know if God can be trusted. I don't know about this relationship I'm in. It is matters of the heart, and the wilderness can hit us inside of us, or the wilderness can take place outside of you. Circumstances that are beyond your control. Circumstances that are outside of your control. Someone sins against you. A child goes this direction. A boss makes this choice. Finances happen this way, right? Things that are outside of my control that happen to me but causes me to enter into a wilderness season in my life. A time of uncertainty and fear. It comes unexpectedly. But either way, your life is thrown into chaos and you find yourself in the desert where it is frightening, where it is dangerous, and where it is exhausting. The flip side of that is the wilderness is also a place of beauty and growth and peace. You see, God does His greatest and deepest work in the deserts of my life. 15 David stories come out of the wilderness years, where God did soul-shaping work in David in the desert, as David learns to see God in places where he would have never looked previously. I mean, think about it. Think about David's early years. It is God who delivered me from the bear and from the lion. It is God who will cause this giant to fall. It is God who is doing His work. Like, that's where David saw God. He saw God delivering him from danger. He saw God slaying a giant. That's where David saw God when he wasn't in the desert. But now David's in the wilderness. David's on the run. He's on the move. He's living life in caves. And where does David see God? He sees God in this moment where he says, "This is the Lord's anointed. I'm not going to slay Saul." He sees Saul from a different perspective. Why? Because God is shaping his soul in the desert and in the wilderness. And David catches a glimpse of who God is in a very different way than he has ever experienced and known before. He even sees his enemy as God's anointed. I love this truth. I mentioned it in our call to worship, but one of the most common descriptors of God that we find in the songs that David wrote during his wilderness season is he most often refers to God as refuge. 37 times in the Psalms, he refers to God as refuge. Now, for David, a refuge is more than a place to run for protection, a place to be relieved for the moment. Did David experience refuge as a place to run while he is in the wilderness? Yes. The very story that we read in 1 Samuel 24 is this En Gedi, is this oasis in the desert where they could drink water and they could rest in this moment. And so there is these moments of refuge in David's wilderness season. But during this season, God is shaping David. He is causing David to see things differently. And so as David is penning the words to Psalms, a refuge becomes more than just an oasis in the desert where he can find relief. A refuge is God. God is his refuge. You see, the wilderness forces David to run after God, to pursue God, to find his security, not in his circumstances, not in his surroundings, not in what's going on or not going on in his life, not in who's in his corner and who's not in his corner. The wilderness causes David to find his security only in God, that God is his refuge. And that's what deserts do. That's what the wilderness does. It forces us to run after God, to pursue him. Important here. The wilderness in and of itself is not what makes that happen. There's two leaders in the wilderness, isn't there? There's a guy named Saul and there's a guy named David. Both Saul and David are in the wilderness. But what's Saul doing? Saul is running after David. He's trying to control his own fate. He's trying to take matters into his own hands. He's trying to eliminate the circumstances that are a threat to him. That's what Saul's doing in the desert. But what's David doing? David is running after God. He is running after who God is. He is running after God as his refuge. David finds in the desert in God what Saul is looking for, a refuge and a strength. Saul wants to eliminate David so that he can find his strength in who he is. David is running after God, and he finds in God a refuge and strength that will protect him. The wilderness is a dangerous and lonely place. You ever watch the show on the History Channel called Alone? You may or may not be familiar with this show. Basically, they take usually 10, 12 people and they put them in some of the most remote parts of the world. They get to choose 10 things to go with them. So like, they have a saw or whatever. They have a bow and arrow. They can't take like a gun. Their weapons are usually a bow and arrow, something like that. And they drop them. They do not have cameramen. They do not have people that are with them to support them. They have to do their own filming, all these things, and they drop them. And most of the time it's in some remote part of Canada or even up in Alaska. And they drop them there to survive. And whoever stays the longest wins the money. That's the whole storyline of the show. Most often, there's two primary reasons that contestants leave the show. Reason number one is they get hungry and they're not able to bring in enough fish or big game or small game to be able to feed themselves and sustain themselves for that length of time. I think the dude that has survived the longest on that show stayed for over 100 days. You imagine 100 days feeding himself and providing shelter for himself and all that in harsh winter weather. But most of the time they either go home because they're hungry, or the second reason they most often go home is, as you can imagine, loneliness. They're tired of waking up alone, thinking about, I got to provide for myself today. My family, my kids are back home. It's a mental game for them. And the wilderness becomes, in many ways, a place of beauty for them. They explore the things that they have learned and trained themselves for, and this rewarding. They build their own shelter. They catch fish. They feed themselves. And then reality sets in. And it becomes a place of absolute loneliness, absolute abandonment, absolute fear, absolute uncertainty. The wilderness shapes them. It shapes them in how dangerous it is and how lonely it is. Just like the seasons of life that are our desert moments, our wilderness moments where we feel empty and afraid. And this wilderness can be dangerous, it can be lonely, but can also be a wonderful place. And listen, for the follower of Jesus, it can be an essential place because it causes us to run after God, to find refuge in Him, to recognize we are not in control. I must trust the one who is. And when you're in the wilderness, when you're in the desert season of life and you are forced to run after this God, this refuge, here's what you find. He's trustworthy. He's good. He's sovereign. He's in control. I can trust Him. And that's why God often does His most significant work in our lives in those wilderness seasons, because we are forced to run after and rely on God and not my strength, my ability, my work ethic, my innovation. I am stripped of who I am, and I am forced to trust in who He is. You see, when things are going great, I got it. I'm in control. But in those desert wilderness moments when things are out of my control, spinning out of control in my heart and mind, spinning out of control in those circumstances outside of me, in those moments I am forced to rely upon the one who is good and sovereign and in control. I am stripped of who Devin is, and I am forced to lean into who I am in Christ. And that is a good and healthy thing for me to go through those wilderness moments where God does His soul shaping in my life. So, this is not a hang in there speech. This is not an inspirational speech that says, you're going to make it through it, just hang in there. This is not a hang in there speech. This is the desert will suck the life out of you, and you may not be able to hang in there. So run to Jesus, because He's the author. He's the finisher of our faith. Which leads to our final thought. Jesus is the greatest example of what it looks like to trust fully in God's timing and to trust fully in God as a refuge. You see, in His desert moments, Jesus prays, God, not my will, but yours be done. For 40 days and nights in the wilderness, Jesus trusts the Father fully and completely. You see, Jesus did what David was ultimately incapable of doing on his own. Jesus did what I am incapable of doing on my own. My faith is limited. My trust is flawed. But Jesus enters our broken world. He willingly enters the desert, and He is faithful and obedient and steadfast on my behalf. You see, the bigger and better story that God was writing for David and was writing for you and I was the story of God the Son taking on human flesh to do what we are incapable of doing, and providing a way for us to be a part of God's redemptive story, not based on my own grit and determination and merit, but based on the perfect life and ultimate sacrifice of Jesus. And that is why God is my refuge and strength, not because of how strong I am, not because of how faithful I am, but because of how strong strong and faithful He is. That's why we sing, He is the rock upon which we stand. On Christ, the solid rock, I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. So whatever chapter of your story that you find yourself in today, I want you to be reminded that your story fits within a bigger and better story of which God has already written the ending. Jesus is the hero of this bigger story. Jesus is the hero of this better story. And He has done everything necessary to bring us into God's redemptive story and sustain us through the wilderness seasons of life. So, if you feel like you are slap dab in the wilderness today, threw a southern expression out there for you. If you are slap dab in the wilderness today, look up. Fix your eyes on Jesus. He is our refuge, and He will bring you through this season. He is doing a deeper work in your soul, and He has done everything necessary for you to trust Him in the process. So cling to Him. And if you are not in a wilderness season, or you are coming out of a wilderness season, keep your eyes on Jesus, because He is the provider and the strength through every season of life. Some of you, if not many of you, have heard the little poem that became famous a while back called Footprint. Some of you have it behind glass and in some kind of frame up on your wall somewhere. Footprints basically is this poem that was written that says, I dreamed I was walking along the beach with the Lord, and across the sky flashed scenes from my life. For each scene, I noticed two sets of footprints in the sand. One belonged to me and the other to the Lord. When the last scene of my life flashed before us, I looked back at the footprints in the sand. I noticed that many times along the path of my life, there was only one set of footprints. I also noticed that it happened at the very lowest and saddest times in my life. This really bothered me, and I questioned the Lord about it. Lord, you said that once I decided to follow you, you would walk with me all the way. But I have noticed that during the most troublesome times in my life, there is only one set of footprints. I don't understand why at times when I needed you the most, you should leave me. The Lord replied, my precious, precious child, I love you, and I would never, never leave you during your times of trial and suffering. When you saw only one set of footprints, it was then that I carried you. Beautiful little story, poem, right? A lot of truth in it. Here's the one thing I would say about it. Child of God, He is carrying you all the time. There's always one set of footprints. He has picked us up out of the miry clay, David says, and carries us, puts our feet on the rock. So in the good seasons, bad seasons, tough times, good times, guess what? He's carrying you. Because you're not going to make it otherwise. You're not going to make it just with Him by your side. You're only going to make it because He has done everything necessary to pick us up out of our sin and crime and brokenness and carry us home to be with Him. So lean into Him, because you're not only just not walking alone, He is carrying you to the end. He is a faithful, loving, and good high priest, refuge, and rock, and He can be trusted. So when you're in the wilderness season, Lean into him. He's doing soul-shaping work. Allow him to carry you. When you're in the good times, no, it's not because of who you are. It is because of who he is. And he is still carrying you in those seasons. Wilderness, not wilderness. It is all about Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. He is the greater example. He is the greater David. Let's bow our heads for prayer.